We'll record now. And on that note, then I'd like to introduce Beck Seeley, who's been working with Opportunity London on this funding work stream for nearly 2 years now, alongside Nick McHugh, Chair of Opportunity London and Chief Executive for NLA, who is also with us today. So over to you, Beck.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And so if at any point you can't, then please put your hand up or something. Hopefully it'll all be fine. So as Joanne said, I mean, I think this is really intended to sort of pull together all this experience that really is out there. I know that loads of you have really tried very hard to get some stuff over the line. And there's probably a wealth of things out there that didn't quite make it over the line as well, which you probably can't quite easily see. But what we've done is really try to pull together today a range of case studies that are deliberate, all a bit different. So hopefully as we go through, they're going to show you how people have tried different things. So some are like temporary accommodation. Some are very much around sort of a more standard China. We want to, basically build some affordable housing. But I think what we want to try and get out of this is, okay, as we go through, let's look at the individual case studies. We are going to sort of suggest things that maybe that was a bit hard, or maybe that was really strong, just to try and draw on kind of what they each bring out. If you are in the audience and this is one of yours, please do interrupt. We've done this, as Jan alluded to. A lot of this is actually, there's pretty good detailed public knowledge. You guys will know that because you have to write the papers that form cabinet approval papers often. But we also know they're never quite the full picture necessarily. But equally, kind of at the level we're working at, I think it's kind of enough. But do shout out, as Joe said, if something is not quite right interpreted, because I definitely know myself, somebody will say that and you'll think, well, I did that, Jill. It wasn't quite like that. So there's no worries in that. And hopefully we're going to sort of pull together at the end a sort of like a list of sort of some things that, common themes coming through that can help both yourselves and us, because we are looking at trying to work through what models it would take to bring scale institutional investment into London affordable housing, possibly even into London housing more generally, given if there's one thing we know, it's that there's not enough money in housing, doing enough housing at the moment. And hopefully one thing I've added in at the end is in response really to some specific queries that have been made since our roundtable, but also through our general work stream with Opportunity London, London Council's GLA, and London Housing Directors Group, is very much around like, how does this money compare to the cost of PWLP, etc. So we've had a bit of a stab at trying to provide a bit of information on that. I'll caveat that is always a bit of a moving feast, and you can never be quite perfect because things depend on exactly what the profile of structures are. But I'm trying to sort of give everyone a bit of insight, because I think sometimes there might be some myths and legends out there and it's hard to get to like what's real. So hopefully that will, by the end of the session, as said, hopefully it won't have been a waste of time, and you can come out with some things that you can kind of take into whatever way you're trying to deliver housing, because we absolutely know that, we need to do more, and it is really tough out there to try and do it. So if we want to start on with the examples, I think that's where we'll go. We have a relatively quick run through. I'll try and pull them through. So if you wouldn't mind, I think. So first up, we pulled out this example with Barnet and Aviva Capital Partners. For those of you who don't know, there's a message saying can't see. Can everyone else see? Yeah, I can see.
Yeah, I can see, yeah.
Yeah.
Might be worth going out and coming back in again.
Yeah. So pulled out this example because I thought it was interesting to just give a bit of insight into the different ways an institutional investor works as well. So the fact it's Aviva Capital Partners is interesting before we start, in that Aviva is an institutional investor clearly, But the capital partners bit of Aviva is effectively where it puts a pot of its money, so it's like its own money, and is effectively trying to take a little bit more risk and a little bit more innovation around structures to go, okay, can we like basically sort of create more assets that would then potentially be available for long-term institutional kind of hold investment? So this is quite interesting because it's investing from an institutional perspective kind of at the start, with a slightly different form of risk appetite to what you might normally find. And so the structure is interesting. So it's got the institutional investor, it's got Stories, I think, as the development partner. And then it's also obviously got the council in there, and it's council-owned land. From what we can see, the structure is that the council provides the land and kind of sets out a brief as to what it wants. And obviously that comes in with local priorities and, you know, kind of exactly what's going to work in that particular area and borough. Aviva then comes in that kind of long-term patient capital position in exchange for understanding what it's going to get out of the end in terms of that sort of security and stability of returns. From what we saw, it wasn't quite clear which bit of Aviva was which and which parts. So somebody, if there's anyone on, might understand that more. But I think the interesting point was it's kind of pushing people together in their relevant roles. You've got Stories doing the development delivery. And then you've got the council sort of retaining, as we understand it, the long-term management and ownership of those homes. I think some interesting stuff was around it's pretty high affordable. I mean, I think everyone on this call would really like to see numbers like that in terms of affordable delivery. It looked very strong on ESG from what we could see, and a quite interesting model that, given that it's a pretty well-known partner, you know, a developer, it felt like was there something in here that you could actually take and replicate. We probably don't know enough just looking in to go, yes, that's certain. But it was an interesting one to kind of consider bringing all the parties together, council, land, basically trying to deliver a high. Oh, we've got somebody volunteering. I think that was a message there. That's good. I'm just going to turn the chat on. See, you might have to help me with the chat on this. Yeah, so yeah, they do take risks for schemes that don't have planning. Exactly. Absolutely spot on. And so could do something a bit different, whereas normally you would get a kind of, we're really sorry, but you haven't got planning, so we won't do it, from an institutional. And then I think probably some things that come out of that, just thinking through how did they work. We assume the council's taken the operational responsibility. So that means, you know, risk around arrears and maintenance. That's, you know, relatively standard in this sort of model. But again, an interesting one to think about. Often what you might find is, has enough reserving been made, particularly for the long-term future? It looks as well that there's an inflation exposure in there. So some of you might be finding this on things you've done in the past where you might have basically borrowed the money or got the money in, and that's linked to inflation because institutional investors want inflation-linked returns. That's what they like. And then unfortunately, you kind of got the rent in, and the rent didn't go up at quite the level that inflation went up, particularly a few years ago. And now, and then the challenge is, well, you've promised the money to the investor at a certain growth rate, but you can't get the income in at that growth rate. So what do you do then? And that's one that I know quite a lot of people I've been talking to in different organisations. It's not just a housing issue, actually, it's in other assets. It's turned into quite a bit of a challenge. So I think thinking about how your income line really simply is matching with your, basically what you're obligated to pay for your money line, your investment line, is a really important thing. I don't think it means you shouldn't do it. It just means you should think about it and whether there's a risk around that needs thinking about. Maybe you need to put some reserves in, how that happens. And then there's a point here around, and it's difficult to tell because no deal is quick. I mean, that is one of the challenges we've been looking at for a while, is how do you speed up the process, because it takes so long to get anything done. but it did feel like it was pretty complex and it was time consuming. Whether there was something in there, which as you go through these, I think there might often be, which is you started on a journey, then costs went up, then you had to rethink everything because costs had gone up, and then you had to fine tune it, sort out a solution, and get back on the bandwagon to try to make it work, which, you know, we all know has been the reality of life for the last few years. That could be the reason too. But I guess from our perspective, trying to think, oh, is there something we could take and learn out of this? Just like thinking, okay, it looks quite a neat structure. Could it do more? But how could we maybe make that simpler? I guess would be on that. Oh, we've got a message on there. Is that you again, Abid? I think it is. Yeah.
Yes, it is me.
Do you wanna explain it yourself rather than me do it? If you want to add some stuff in.
No, I think you're doing a brilliant job. Thank you. I can probably just fill in some gaps. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
So we've got 3 of these in total. So this is the first one that we've actually secured planning consent for. And we originally, when I went out to the market, and just to qualify, these are built to rent schemes. Okay, because again, you know, just looking at how people's lifestyles are changing, there's been an increase in BTR products coming into the market, co-living, etc. So Aviva and Stories entered into a JV, and then obviously the council then entered into an agreement with Stories ACP. And as I've mentioned in the chat, you know, ACP are on board as part of the first part of the journey up to planning, and then it flips over to the long-term income team at Aviva Investors. So the deal is you've outlined, you know, it's a 125-year lease with a 50-year lease back, and during the 50-year lease back, the amortization of the lease payment is made then to Aviva Investors. It's actually quite a simple process. I took a report to cabinet. We had cabinet approval. It took us about 4 months, I would say, to agree the agreement for lease. 4 to 5 months to agree the agreement for lease. And then Stories of Aviva Capital Partners in the driving seat as far as taking the planning application forward. We secured planning. Trying to remember when we secured planning. I can't remember now, but we are looking to achieve start on site April 2026, and we're currently in just discussions with the GLA around some grant funding for the London Living Rent. So the affordable tenure on this particular product is discounted market rent and London Living Rent, which is in line with GLA's planning policy for BTR type of product. And again, you know, it's a car park. If for those who are familiar with the Barnet landscape, it's Mill Hill. It's in Mill Hill. It's a car park that is underutilized, and we're bringing that forward for much needed homes. The 10-year split enables us to then just reach out to the various different demographics in the borough. At practical completion, we will, and I'm in the process of actually putting together a ManCo, which is a management company, and that management company will sit as a special purpose vehicle alongside the council, and we will manage and operate the asset for the 50-year period. And out of the way that the commercials work is out of the gross rents that are generated from the scheme, a percentage of those gross rents goes towards the lease payment to the institutional investor. You've got your 20% OPEX, and then you're left with a residual 15 to 20%, which we often refer to as profit rent. And then that helps the council. So not only are we regenerating underutilized sites, we're delivering 50% affordable housing on our own land, and then there is a sort of a cherry on the cake in terms of there is some additional profit rent that the council generates that we can then use to deliver other services.
these, in summary, pretty neat structure. I think that would be fair to say.
Yeah. So like I said, so we've got two with Aviva, probably in the circle of about 300 to 400 million in terms of investment in the borough. And we have another one in Burnt Oak that we're progressing. So in total, we've got about 1,000 homes that are being delivered by utilising institutional capital.
Yeah, and I guess what I picked up was a point, straight away and you made it in there, in that it's ACP putting the first bit in.
Correct.
So if you were in a traditional model, you'd have to find someone with the development capital to put it in.
Yeah.
And then
So apologies. So what's really interesting is that two of our schemes, ACP, are actually forward funding, whereas the third scheme with another institutional investor is where the developer is actually forward funding.
Yeah.
So, but both models work.
Yeah. It's just, I guess, in this market, development capital's hard to find sometimes.
Yeah. Can be.
Okay. All right. That's great. Thank you for helping out. That's brilliant. That's exactly what we want, because it's much better from the horse's mouth than me. So shall we keep going on to the next one? I'm conscious I'll move them through, but thank you very much. Really, really welcome the contribution. I don't know whether we've got anyone on from Westminster. Shout if you're there. So this one we picked up because I thought it was an interesting one, because it was temporary accommodation as well. So trying to get a mix of things that everyone could see had been done. So I think a couple of the 151s in London informed me that there's quite a lot of technicality in this one as to how the rules work on what you can enter into and what you can't. We can't see that level from just looking in. But I think what we're trying to do, I guess, here is just run through the principles. If there is someone out there who knows more about this, then just shout. But I'm sure that we can connect into Westminster if anyone wants to kind of learn more about this in a lot more detail. But I think, so basically there's a partnership here with Macquarie, interesting, big Australian kind of multi-investor. Actually, I was with this morning a big investment summit, and actually Macquarie were sat alongside. They've just signed a very big check to enter into Birmingham Airport, which is, big investment. Phoenix Group, sort of pension type group. And so this is financing and retrofitting over sort of 350 homes for TA. So I think from what we can see, it's sort of like, again, so what we're starting to see now is some themes going through. So it's a long lease, 42 years. And it's the institutional funding, so funds as the actual buying of them, so the acquisition and then the retrofitting as well. So council, again, another theme we're sort of seeing through here now. So council's got quite strong control, so it's getting in there. It is procuring and managing the properties. And then again, similarly, mechanism at the end, the ownership reverts back to the borough. So in summary, it's leveraging a really good credit rating of a council. Interesting for being applied to TA. There's a few more things as we go through that I think might do that as well, but this very specific one for this issue. Also, though, gaining the energy and the retrofit upgrade, and also ultimately trying to get that money to give you an asset at the end of it, rather than, I guess, bluntly dead money in just paying rent for other properties that you need to put people in. At least you get something at the end. I think there was something around an exclusivity agreement with an existing provider. We picked that up. There might be some details in that. I guess the reason for me putting that in here when we're going through it was, life isn't always perfect. Life isn't always like, oh, we're just going to start from nothing and kind of do something. Sometimes you will just have existing stuff that was done for very good reason, but you need to do something different or something extra. And so I think there was a bit of like innovation here in trying to how do you make this work, get it done. And I guess one of the other things that comes up and probably is one of the themes, quite a lot of people in the deal again. So it can working, but lots of people involved in it. So again, governance, who's doing what, and making sure that that's kind of really well set out and managed, probably pretty important to making these things successful. On the assumption there's no one from Westminster, I'm going to kick on to the next one then.
Yeah, thanks, Beck.
So if we move on to that one. There. So this is the RKBC one. So I think we might have somebody on the call from there. So this is a really interesting one because if you stand right back, you will have seen, I mean, I was at this investment thing today with the pension announcement, an awful lot of pressure on why can't we get more money into housing from pension funds? And there's a whole load of reasons why, if you're a pension fund, it's not quite as easy as going, oh yes, there's a housing crisis, it would be sensible, we'll just put lots of money in housing because that would all make sense. Some of it is around the level of returns that certainly housing can give. Some of it is around the nature of a property asset. And some of it is just around very kind of regulated positions on like how you spread the money of a pension fund into a mix of assets, given that it's a highly regulated industry. So I think government has been doing quite a lot around, well, if there's barriers in there that are sort of regulatory, fiduciary, are they real barriers in that they're really needed to protect people, or are they barriers that just might have been built up over time because they have, in which case could they not be changed? And then I think this one was looking at, well, okay, we're a borough, we've got housing problems. Could we not look at actually directly talking to our pension scheme about whether there's a position where they could invest some of their money in the problems that we as a borough have, solve some of those problems, and in doing all of that, the return, obviously the pension scheme needs to make the return, but it's kind of making a return on things that are ultimately really benefiting the area, and kind of very neat circle obviously in that. So I think what has happened is like a deal around allocating investment into housing in the borough. I think it's specifically around acquisition of properties. And I think if someone's from David Allen, you might just want to take over then, David, and do the detail for me.
Yeah, I mean, this is to it's 100 million that has been allocated from all of their property interests, and it's to acquire temporary accommodation. The idea is we will be buying properties where we'll be able to put tenants into the properties immediately. So it isn't properties which need to have anything done to it. So what we're doing is basically buying blocks which don't have any Section 106 or affordable housing or anything like that in. They just have private let. So the pension, basically what happens is we search for those properties with the agents. We make sure they are suitable for housing needs. Generally, we are buying properties which are having more 2 and 3 bed within them. So they're for families, not for individuals. We will say, in effect, yes, from the model that we've agreed with them, and also from a housing needs perspective, and also from a band contractors and materials perspective. We will then pass that to CBRE advisors, who are the advisors of the pension fund, and the pension fund will acquire it. In terms of financials, basically the way it works is the pension fund acquire it as a property asset, and therefore they acquire it at market value. But as soon as it goes into the fund, we transfer it by various covenants that we're giving into basically a financial instrument. So from that point onwards, it's no longer looked at as a property, but as a financial instrument, and therefore its returns are therefore mirroring a linker, in effect, a long indexed gilt. So in effect, we give a an arrangement. It's not called a lease. It's an arrangement for actually, again, 50 years. The rent that we would pay is in effect half what we would pay if of our interest costs, but for the pension fund, they will get a higher return than if they invested just in gilts by itself. So basically, it's a win for them. They are ticking all of their fiduciary duties in terms of the return, and it's a win for us because we're paying less money than we could borrow or than we could rent. At the end of the period of the arrangement, the property reverts to the pension fund, and the way the returns actually work for them is because they are valuing that reversionary interest rather than what would be normal, like with Aviva and these type of deals, is you basically amortize it down to in effect say the property is worth zero at the end of that 50 years. So they're actually putting something in, and because of that, that improves the return profile across the whole investment. We're in the process now of, the reason we haven't put it out totally is because we want to actually buy some properties. So we have various properties that we are looking at acquiring. All the properties that we're looking to acquire are out of Borough, because actually our TA is about 80% out of Borough. But I think that's probably enough to go for now.
That's brilliant. That's really helpful. So if I was to sort of summarize just the key financial feature, effectively you get a cheaper rent now because the pension fund is valuing the long-term value of the property. Whereas if you, as you're saying, if you were doing it on a standard position from one of these long-term leases, they just write it down to zero. So you effectively have to pay for the property over the period. So you've got access to
exactly
basically cheap rent property versus what you would otherwise pay, which is quite interesting because obviously that rent is coming off ultimately your TA budget, isn't it? So it's reducing your TA budget. So it's quite an interesting one to look at. I guess the things that I kind of think on this, is, more broadly, could you replicate this? There's definitely lots of interest from local government pension funds in how you do this. So that's
yes.
There.
So we've already started talking to some of the other pension funds across the country because it's very easy for them to model. Just in terms of there's a question that is there. So basically, we take on in effect a fully repairing and insuring lease. We are renting it at full LHA, and then we are assuming from that gross income that we are netting down that income by about 30 to 40%. And therefore 60, 70% that we give to the pension fund. So it's all modeled in there that the voids, bad debt, maintenance and management are all covered by ourselves, but actually financially, they're also all covered.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a really good one to look at in terms of like how, you can basically work really, really closely with an aligned fund. Particularly, obviously, you've got a place thing here where, aligned on the place, but that could be replicated more broadly. Thank you very much, David. Oh, there's a question there we might as well cover now.
Yeah, I did cover that.
Did you just cover that? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I hadn't read it. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Owen. Should we just move on to the next one then? Thanks, David. So I don't know whether they've got anyone from Barking and Dagenham on, but we do, yeah. So this is Rail Pen. So that's like the big rail pension fund. She says, having done quite a few agreements into rail, notoriously tricky to negotiate with people. And so this one I thought was interesting, Trocol House. So if we've got anyone on, then shout when I go wrong, or you want to have more detail. So I think for starters, it was interesting that it wasn't a pure local government pension fund, because one of the things that does get sort of said around a bit is, oh, you know, when it comes down to it, LGPS is possibly your only place to go for kind of, you know, buy your Avivas and your LNGs. Well, actually, this was a slightly different one, so this sort of extended it. So this is another industry one, though. And I think from what we could see, I mean, this scheme I bought through because I think it has been on a journey, and it's particularly one where I think the contractor, it was one of the ones that the contractor went bust on. And so that obviously put quite a lot of stress into the project. But from what we can see, it is a BTR scheme, but 35% affordable. It's next to a station. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. I was trying to imagine our rail pension fund next to station. I can imagine what that might have been interesting to them in terms of the story you would tell. You might tell me, whoever's on or whatever, that was totally meaningless to them. But
no, it wasn't meaningless at all. Sorry.
Hi Jenny, do you want to take over a little bit?
This wasn't one of my schemes, so I am winging it a bit, and I'm having had a little bit of a read through to refresh my memory. But yeah, I think the adjacency to the station and the fact that this is almost sort of seen as part of a wraparound to Barking Station, I think that was attractive to them. They weren't the original owners of the site. Patrizia, I think I've pronounced that correctly, were the original owners of the site, and they sold it to Railpen, who brought this scheme forward. But yeah, I mean, it's you know, it's a key sort of, it almost bookends. There's another building that was identical to the small office block that was here before, is on the other side. So this is sort of very much part of the regeneration of the station area in Barking, and was much maligned when it first started because it got rid of the Weatherspoons that was underneath the office block, but apparently that's part of the deal for them to come back, so the residents of Barking will be happy soon. So Railpen obviously brought this forward. You're right, it's been on a journey. The HG group with the contractors went bust, unfortunately, and I think you've seen some of the reports that went back to Cabinet for our Cabinet to approve a new deal with them. They put an offer on the table and we counter offered, and they did accept that, so it is moving forward now, but it's not been without its problems. It obviously got caught up in the second stair issues as well, so it's coming out of the ground now. Very, very noisy when you're near the station, but hopefully it's on its way to being complete.
Great. And I guess the thing to pull through from this is definitely in, I would say, the last like 1 to 2 years, probably before then, but I think it's just become a lot stronger. When we talk to institutionals, they do now talk about, you know, institutional grade contracting packages much more, I think, than they did before.
Yeah.
And Nick McHugh's on the call will attest to this. You know, they're pretty clear that they get very nervous when they see, you know, contractors and names they don't recognise, and they want to know that it's going to happen and that it's not basically going to go bust halfway through. So it's an interesting one to sort of work through, because one of the things that I think when you're looking at trying to get stuff moving is that possibly, well, pretty much isn't the cheapest contracting position. So how do we sort of trade these things in that, you know, it won't get funded unless it's got a package that can meet the institutional funding requirements. The whole contracting world's, you know, it's a challenge. I was at a dinner last week for a very, very big 500 million investment, sitting next to the guy who was a sort of developer owner, and he got the investor in, and he basically said, I started with 30 contractors. By the time we got down to who was acceptable, I mean, clearly it's a very big ticket size, right? He said basically there was 2.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting world now of who can get those sorts of things, you know, and we need to think about that earlier. Should we go on to the next one? So if you won't mind. Whoever's got the slides. So this one I thought we'd put in because it's probably more like a master development scheme. Everyone will know Brent Cross, huge scheme. And, it's Argent as the kind of master developer. But then I thought it was quite interesting how it was layering bits of capital and to show how, you've got different portions of capital going in, effectively, basically different points of certainty. So you've got, Brent Cross, big master plan, etc., etc. We all know that. Great big transformation. Related Argent. So you've got, in there with capital already, but related Argent, US capital, and that's capital that kind of, generally unlocks schemes and will generally have quite a high rate of return that it needs to get, because it's the sort of capital that goes in right at the start and goes, okay, I can believe in 30 years it's going to be all right and it'll be great. But then it was sort of looking down as to, okay, so then plots start to come off. So things unravel, things get progressed, things get sort of planning, etc. And how did this sort of fit together with the institutionals then coming in to fund, I think, particularly build to rent? There'll be a level of affordable in there, I'm sure, and it's quite interesting. So you've got your council ultimately, I think, retaining freehold, not unusual in those sorts of structures. But from what we could see, and clearly, there might be a level of detail there we're missing, but it's actually needing a lot of the infra delivery. So that's interesting because it's taking some risk out and possibly actually some things that only a council possibly can do. And then related Argent is delivering effectively, like, what's the planning? How do we need to get this going? How do we package these things up? So it's sort of taking down the risk another chunk and getting it into like, oh, kind of, here's a parcel now. It's low risk. It's got planning. It will go. And effectively kind of like, okay, well, what will, can we get institutional money into that? And what level of risk will that institutional money take? And I thought this one was quite interesting because, and there might be someone on the call who knows this better, but it felt like, certainly I kind of know a couple of the investors that they had certainty maybe on the first bit, but they were prepared to take a bit around like basically the second and third assets in the kind of broader plot. So they didn't have everything locked down. And that's when you start to get, for me, how do we kind of move the dial, push things forwards, kind of get some different stuff going. So okay, that's quite interesting. So because normally if you go back, 5-10 years, institutional, unless it's all locked down and like very, very low risk, we're not really very happy with it, we won't touch it. You see ACP, the first example, the institutional going, Viva, I need to find a different way to unlock these things. So putting some money in a pot and going, right, you can be called ACP and you can go and do some slightly different things to try to get stuff moving. And here you're like, okay, so they're taking a slightly different risk profile, and that maybe what they need is certainty on some things moving, but they can get their head around that actually the second and the third bit might take a bit longer and they need to get a level of risk in there. So I think it's just quite interesting on how that's set up. I think we might try and get a bit more. Well, Emily, do you want to add anything?
Sorry. I can add a little bit of detail to this.
That would be great.
So the model is a master developer model, but it's a 50-50 joint venture. So the council's a 50% partner. Related Argent is then appointed as the DM for the overall development. Under the terms of the project agreement that we have together, they then get first refusal to draw down the plots. So by and large, Related Argent will draw down the kind of the residential plots, and then we do third-party sales for the non-standard stuff, the stuff that isn't their day-to-day bread and butter. The council did lead on the infrastructure delivery of some of the big ticket items at the beginning. So Brent Cross West Station is a good example of that. And we managed to secure almost £500 million of central government investment to help to support that. So there was a £180 million Homes England loan that helped to kind of enable the development to get off the ground, and then a significant investment into the delivery of some of the critical infrastructure. And the reason for that is sort of going back in time. originally the whole scheme was led by Hammerson's, and about 5 years ago, Hammerson's sort of exited, and the scheme, which was one enormous planning application, kind of got divided up, and the council ended up bringing forward Brent Cross Town, which is the bit to the south of the shopping centre. The way the development works is by, we work in development phases as opposed to planning. Well, we work in planning phases and development phases. They don't always marry up. The affordable housing is worked out through a viability testing regime per planning phase, and then the development phase will treat the affordable housing as a development cost. So it allows the plots to come forward independently through their independent delivery model, and the overall kind of RLV model will calculate the affordable housing into the phase costs. We also have a strategic infrastructure charge that each plot has to pay, which then creates a pool of resource to deliver on some of the big ticket Section 106 items. So things like the schools, the parks and open spaces, some of the public realm that's kind of not related to a specific plot or phase.
Right, and can you give us anything on the sort of the investor alongside related Argent, and what risk they were prepared to take, or is that less of your, is the way it's structured, as you see less of that? I don't know.
We see less of that. So the plot developer will go out and secure the investment largely through joint ventures. At the moment, that's the model that they're progressing. So I know you've referenced Investco in here. There's also been some deals done more recently with Japanese investment. But we see less of that from the council side. It's somewhat insulated. We there's a very clear division within related Argent between the joint venture and the plot development business necessarily. So we deal on the joint venture side.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for adding that. Really helpful. And I guess, you know, just sort of pulling through. I mean, one thing that does strike you when you look at that is risk is quite chopped up and diversified. And I think you just illustrated it there, Emily. It's sort of like really kind of, you know, you can spread it out. And obviously with something the size of that, if you're going to get ultimately all the way to an institution, you kind of need to chop it up to get it to a point where they will do it. And I think it's an interesting one over, again, making sure that the council's leading on the design and place and that kind of work through. Probably one thing to bring through, because it's a bit of a contrast, is that you've got less control over rent and management because it's gone effectively as a parcel. So it's set up front in terms of the framework, but once it's kind of out, then it has gone. Probably theme complex governance, because you've got a lot of people, and everyone has got, you know, their role and managing all of that. And then probably what you often would find on large scheme, particularly when you bring your investment, is that maintain your affordable and work out how that goes through. I think you gave us a little bit there, Emily, on how sort of like it goes in as development costs, but trying to make sure that, because sometimes what you find is basically inconsistency in how that's done. And it's quite interesting as to quite often institutionals are, I would say, increasingly like they want to know that the scheme is at least trying really hard and delivering something on the affordable. I don't think we're in a world of institutionals going, you know, this is a BTR, so I'm happy to invest in BTR and it's done nothing on affordable. I think they obviously need the numbers to work, but they're trying to balance all of those things. They're very aware of that point. We got a comment. What's interesting in all these models is the local authorities place investors. Yeah. So set the agenda, hold the land in many cases. Yeah. But a lot, I think virtually many, all of these will be like that. And let the capital do what it does best, deploy and grow. Comes down to local authorities' risk appetite. And maybe come through to that at the end in the sort of plenary, but I think definitely and what risk you're prepared to put in, you know, particularly we've seen structures as we've been going through quite a lot around guarantees and obligations. Not everyone is prepared or willing to do that. This one doesn't have that. It's a different model in terms of, you know, the local authority role is slightly more different. Should we move on to the next one, if you don't mind, whoever's got slides? Okay, so I thought I'd pull in London Civ. So we've been talking to London Civ. So obviously this is a pooling arrangement for borough pension funds. So it allows them to sort of like put all their money together, so they do it in like a really efficient way. Government is very much trying to encourage this. I think they're trying to get super pools. I'm not sure that's the right word, but that kind of concept. Hopefully then that allows like bigger pots of capital to invest in affordable and BTR. And it's one of the things that with the work that we've been doing on trying to think through and, you know, really kind of get a lot of detailed understanding and push with investors over what it would take to get scale investment, the bigger pools come through as like a really clear sort of movement in the same direction. So what you find in most places is there's managers in there. So for example, like people like L&G who kind of help allocate that capital. And what it should do is, because you've got everything together, is it should basically cut the cost of management and enable bigger things to be done, which wouldn't be able to be done if you're just taking out of individual pots, because there wouldn't be enough money, or they represent too much risk apportionment into one asset within those funds. So I guess the key point to pull through here is this pooling thing. You can see it live in action, sort of enabling that diversified investment because it's, you know, coming together. Governance is quite interesting. So governance is something we've picked up and analysed and looked at, and it keeps coming up. Obviously, the bigger the organisation, the bigger the structure, your cost of governance, if that's a good phrase to use, is in a way lower per home than it is if you're trying to do multiple small things. So there's an efficiency in that, definitely. There's also the point on consideration. The flip side of that is, yes, you might get efficiency, but do you lose locality and local influence? So they're an interesting one to try to work through a balance on. I suspect there is no perfect answer on that, but it definitely is there as a tension. And I think interesting that somebody picked up, particularly they were concerned about the impact reporting and not being able to link that back to local boroughs. I'm not sure whether that's something that, you know, could be addressed if a bit more thought and effort was put into it, or actually just fundamentally is something that is more challenging to do. So we thought it was interesting to put this up. I don't know whether anyone's on the call had experience of working with the Civ or not. Shout or stick your name in the chat if you do, but they're definitely interested in trying to do more and really trying to think creatively, which is kind of what we really want from investors, and think about what risks that they could accept, and how they might get comfortable that they're actually well managed. Okay, so that's that one. If we move on. So brought in capital letters, I think, because there's been quite a bit of feedback from our last round table on just, you know, making sure we didn't lose the learnings from this, which I think has been a sort of structure and organisation that has definitely delivered a lot of things, but has also probably shone a light on a few things to think about and kind of learn from if you're trying to do a structure that's, you know, quite large, kind of pan London, and how it kind of plays through. So there's some institutional type investment structures in there, particularly over, you know, trying to basically pool this procurement of effectively PRS type homes for, I think, homeless, and then I think it kind of went into some of the temporary accommodation pieces as well, but principally I think the initial thesis was on trying to move homeless into housing. So it was owned by the boroughs, I think. Initially, though, the funding was from government grants, and then they introduced a range of institutional capital as they went through to obviously try and gear up and like have more capital to deploy. what is really interesting is clearly the pooling effect took out competition and kind of collated demand for those participating. And so we can see some really interesting parallels with some of the things we've been thinking through on investment, in that what you haven't got then is, LNG, Aviva, whoever it is, basically doing a bit of a roadshow around boroughs and picking, which is clearly great if you're picked. What do we do about if you don't get picked? And kind of like, is that the best way of allocating it? Don't know. There's no perfect answer on it, but clearly you can reduce the level of sort of, competition among everyone's self in kind of a pooling model. I think there's an interesting piece around standards. In this concept, I think it was standards on accommodation. I think when we think about, okay, how can we get more capital and deliver more homes, it could be, coming back to the point discussed earlier, standards on construction contracts. So this is what an institutional package needs to be. Investors, they will accept this and kind of take out the ambiguity, and this is what you need, and kind of it just stops all the kind of debating on it. And then a view on, did collective procurement enhance negotiating power? Well, I think probably it did. It's difficult to see really clearly because in the time this operated, the market was moving so much. It's really difficult to track what's real and not real. But you'd assume that for a volume purchase and equally a volume of capital deployment, there will be efficiencies, and you will get through that into ultimately a better rate. In terms of considering this, I think there was the obvious issue why it really struggled, in that it was very challenging in a period of high rental growth. And the issue I think we probably all know in terms of where rent is versus local housing allowance, which is particularly magnified in London. And then I think what's an interesting one for us thinking about structures on longer-term capital going forwards is there's quite a lot of grant funding at the start, all great. The trouble is when that's not there, and if it depends on it. So how do you think through what is the financial sustainability, and that's kind of collectively bought into? It's not unusual that things need grant, we know that, but what do you do about kind of that not always being there, and how that works through? I think that's a challenge, particularly on things like management costs. I think you probably need to think around models where, and certainly we're looking at models where the management costs can be paid, because otherwise the model itself is very vulnerable, and I think that's a challenge that this one had. And a really interesting one that we discussed at the round table, for those of you who were there in April, which I think there's no sort of firm position on, because it doesn't really need to be, is sort of does everyone need to be in? Clearly not. Do some who want to and will benefit be in? Yes. Would some people not be sure? And does that make a difference in kind of how committed people are? I think from a kind of trying to get a body of institutional capital, if you can get a group of people who are really committed and enough energy into that, then that will get moving. But it's definitely one to think about in terms of going forwards on models. I don't know whether anyone wants to add anything on this one particularly that I haven't covered. No. Might flip on to the next slide then if we could. So what I've tried to do here is try to pull everything together and go, okay, well, running through all those, a bit of a kind of, sort of not completely random, I must say, but a relative, sort of throw through what have we done? What do we learn from it? And I think some of the comments, and, be interesting if people want to add stuff in here and shout out now. So interesting, I think, just coming to, Abid, your comment on the leadership thing sort of pretty much go straight into the first comment on the place. So, what are you wanting to do? and how are you going to get it, and a lot of commonality coming through on the local authority, public sector, really kind of trying to steer that. Because the public sector is intervening in the case of market failure, therefore it's trying to address it. What you also see coming through is the nature of the capital as a strategic partner. So what I don't think you see really in many of these combinations of deals at all is it's like a bank. You can just rock up, get a bit of money and walk away and just send them a few reports every now and then. It doesn't work like that. That you've got to allocate the risk structure carefully. There's a lot of structuring required generally, and governance, etc. So it really is a partnership model that's needed with this. The next area that I think we're probably looking at for our sort of next chunk of work, trying to help you all more with is, and pulling some of the learning out of these, is the financial structuring tools. So I've sort of deliberately kept it quite high level, and some of you have really helped with detail as we've gone through, but there are quite a lot of embedded structuring things in here. So you've got long leases, we started off with those. Guarantees, we've got some of those going through here. We've got some co-investment going through, be it like cash or be it infrastructure type things. And definitely got some sort of pooling of assets and resources, trying to get ultimately that capital to a cost that works. Because if you didn't do all those structures, it just wouldn't work. So how can we kind of learn more about those, learn more about what's sort of, what people might like and not like about them. And I guess also we might have some 151s on here, what's doable for different boroughs, because not everyone has the same risk appetite and not everyone has the same balance sheet. So how can we demystify that a bit? I think there's been definitely a lot of feedback is, can we put some effort into that? I think what was interesting going through was that pretty much all of the structures and arrangements have really thought about social outcomes. Some were, more pronounced than others, but really tried to align earning the return with the delivery of that. So kind of basic, but I thought it was worth pulling out that we haven't got a load of sort of capitalists who don't care, but the structures are designed to try to make sure, and I think you're seeing that actually institutional investors does care an awful lot about trying to do the right thing. It's very important to them. Reputation is really, really important to these guys. Then the other thing that comes through, sort of related to the structure piece, maybe sort of slightly additional, is this governance and capacity point. So I didn't do it. One of my colleagues was going to do it, but we sort of gave up after a couple of examples, because we tried to work out how many parties are in each deal and just do like a nice little matrix just to sort of illustrate the point. It got a bit out of hand. I think that probably tells us. And then we couldn't decide whether someone was a core party or a sub party. But there's a lot of people, and that means really clear governance. And I think what that means on a local authority part is you've got to have the capacity to kind of think about that. Or do you come in at a point in the structure where you don't have to do that? I think there's some choices in that. So, but to sort of think that it's going to be really straightforward and easy, I just don't think the structures out there that they probably exist like that. There's always going to have to be a level of that in there. The scale versus local impact point, that comes up a lot. I flagged it when we went through the examples. And it definitely is something that we think about a lot. Is it just, frankly, an inevitable trade-off that if you can get something that is simpler, possibly a bit cheaper because it's at scale, quicker possibly, the trade-off is, yes, it is more of a sausage machine. I don't know where we are on solving that at the moment, but it's definitely it's right front and centre, I guess, particularly with many of you who will have borough members, you know, he want to understand and have input into that. And then the final point I've brought through is around borrowing companies. And I think what we didn't do in this was delve into the sort of a lot of the volume around sort of borough housing delivery companies. We tried to stay into picking examples where it was more a range of institutional investment opportunities. Clearly there's a wealth in there, but it's a slightly different mix of things. But I guess the point anywhere is that, you know, if you're going to sort of set up a company like that or an enterprise or fund, whatever it is, the point for the public sector generally, I think, to consider is, you know, how do you make sure that you can sustain the management costs and that there's the right governance and that actually it can live, and it doesn't end up with not being able to earn enough to kind of keep going, and that needs to be thought through in a structure, because what you do find, Capital S is not the only example by a long way of things that might have started off with a bit of grant, then the grant disappeared, then the operating model came under stress to fund effectively a base load of cost, and then ultimately it just didn't work because it hadn't been structured enough to think of that at the start, or perhaps actually it never could sustain that. I wonder whether anyone's got anything they want to contribute in addition to that list, anything that's sort of come up as we're going through that people think missed or want to emphasize. Yeah, Abid.
Just as an observation, I was just going to say that just on the second bullet point in terms of low cost finance. So I think maybe 2 years ago that was the case, but because gilt yields have been going the wrong direction, that low cost finance is kind of not there anymore. You know, I know when we were doing the modelling originally on the schemes, for example, the Buns Lane stories, I think we were looking at 2.5%, 2.2 2.75%, but at the moment gilt yields are 5% and above. So just bear that in mind, everybody, when you're looking at these things, that when you do your business cases, that over the passage of time things will move, and therefore you just need to find other ways in how you actually make the schemes viable.
Yeah, maybe the word should read lower, actually, because it's all relative, isn't it? Right, and we'll come to that in a minute, because gilts are high, as we know. It's a good point, Joanne.
Yeah, just to respond to that point about the rising cost of gilts, just at the time of the Labour conference, we had a flurry of activity from an investor, and Sue can sort of passport you to London Council's finance team on this, who was putting forward a model about patient equity to enable schemes to stack up for a borough as well, but then for that patient equity to be cashed out at a time and reinvestment take place so that it could work over a phased period. And that just got me wondering about whether boroughs could be patient equity providers. And I'm thinking about things like right to buy receipts on affordable housing, whether there's any creative ways that we can look at how we can use our PWLP discount, not huge, but a little help perhaps. And certainly, you know, that patient equity was something that we need to explore as to whether it's going to work and be helpful.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've seen it. Oh, sorry, I'll let Rob go first.
Sorry, come off mute. Hi, everyone. So I'm Rob Manning, 151 at Waltham Forest. So funny enough, I'm leading on this patient capital or patient equity point. Cool. I'm going to make CBRE on their Manchester model. So great timing.
Yes.
So I've gone through the model with them, understood it. I've got lots of different options here. I mean, that's based on new builds and build to rent. I'm thinking, can we do this on TA type properties? Using our own pension fund, our own general fund, whatever it could be. So lots of options here, and I will know more over the next couple of days, and then I'll report back to the treasurers, and then hopefully we can see if there's a leg to stand on for all of us, you know.
That's great. Yeah, I was going to say I see it a lot outside London. I wasn't going to mention the word Manchester, but you did it, Rob. Which is great. I mean, there's definitely. Are you talking to Laura in Manchester, the head of investment?
No, I'm director CBRE, so it's Ian Jenkins, I think, someone like that. So yeah, I'm meeting them first.
Right.
See what we can apply here. But yeah, I will do. If you've got a contact, please, let me know.
Yeah, I will confess we do some work for GMCA and the City Council, so we can possibly directly. Laura's the head of investment at GMCA, and she has a view on effectively the cost of all her sources of capital, and CBRE they've got the link to the pension fund.
Yeah.
Which is where you'll be going in, which is really interesting. Their model is quite interesting in terms of the discount and the rate the money comes out of the pension fund at, and the cost of it is quite interesting.
Yeah.
So no, I think that's great. I mean, the other thing I was just going to pick up on was Joanne's point around right to buy receipts. I see that an awful lot on they will kill me for using this phrase, but I can't think of a better one, like sort of second tier cities. So not your leads, not your big core ones, your sort of mid-range ones where they probably have got actually quite a bunch of that, and they haven't possibly been able to have the scale of projects that can really usefully deploy them. Oh, that's David coming back. And so they're definitely getting their heads around, well, if we could get together larger projects, could we use that as effectively, to your point, around like a bit of a pump prime, and basically go, we've got this money, we could literally just say we don't need any return on this for a while, but could we have a way of getting it back to recycle?
Yes.
And on a bad day we might not get it all back, but it might be a way of sort of pump priming the machine to get everyone else in their various chunks of capital behind it. The other one, so there's right to buy, and then there's the other one is Section 106 sort of off-site allocation, those type receipts where they are. I know there's quite a lot of those. There's a report going around I saw a little while ago in London saying there's quite a lot, but whether they're really a lot or they just haven't been spent on what they're supposed to be spent, there's a slight difference, isn't it, whether they're allocated or not. So I think there's definitely some opportunities in that. If we move on to the capital piece, so I think what we tried to do was literally just go through what we could find in the public domain sources. So it's always a bit of an art, this is, but we tried to reference it back to things we could see that were public sources of information on what these rates are and where we could track them to. I think we all know PWRB is going to be the lowest, but I guess my point here is sometimes institutional capital is not as far away as you might think, depending on the structures that are put around it. And then also what I think is really interesting is where the National Wealth Fund is coming in at. So there's been an awful lot of discussion with the National Wealth Fund and I think Homes England, because Homes England were coming in at more. And there was a lot of discussion over, well, if we're like lending money to an energy plant, why aren't we lending money to housing at the same rate, and how all that works? If there's, I think it was Rob, you're the 151. I mean, I don't know whether you want to comment on this because I don't see what you will see and what you actually pay and how it all works. We've gone through what we can see in the public domain. And I know there's, we've picked off sort of spot things here, but I just thought it would be useful to try and say, you've got a batch of sort of public sector type funding structures at the top of the page. And then as you go down, where is institutional coming in at? We've been talking to institutional for a long time about around the 7.5 to 8 position for an income position. So, do you want to go, Rob, and crack me?
You're bang on. These numbers are quite live. I'm just having a discussion with L&G at the moment, and you're banging the right ballpark there. Often for us, fun enough, it's not the rate that makes the difference for institutional investors. It's how we account for it.
Yeah.
If we do way, we don't have to incur MRP, or certainly not MRP up front. So often that gives us the headroom in the general fund. So there's There's
I
ways.
see where you're going. Yeah.
That's the biggest difference. Otherwise, we'd all just go PWB all the time because it's just simpler and less sort of. But it is the accounting treatment sometimes, which isn't always the right answer. But that does give us that little bit of flexibility often in the early years of a capital program.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess what we're seeing as well, so 7.858 they're coming in at for income. They're coming in at, I mean, they call it blending a bit of development risk. What I think they really mean is institutional money is not the sort of money that goes, oh, I can see a site and one day in 10 years, 15 years, there might be something. It's not that sort of money. I think it can be the sort of money where if you've got a detailed planning permission, it can kind of get its head around a degree of cost and revenue risk. And when you get into that, they're sort of getting themselves into sort of the high single digits. So they're up at 8, 9, possibly 10. Once you start going north of that, materially or into sort of open market sales type big long-term development type risk, which is not leg space. So I think some of that as well is when you're playing around with this, is like if you've got somebody saying, well, income, so I'm just literally just sort of like income and it's very low risk because it's kind of affordable housing. I'm in the 7.5 area. How do you package up the things on your scheme to try to make it feel as low risk-free as possible, close to that, when it actually, if you presented it badly and thought about it badly, it might be nearer a 9 or 10 because the difference makes a massive amount as to whether anything works. And then the other piece obviously is how do you take, if you can't make it work on a 7.58 number, how do you take potentially some public source of some discounted source? Is it the Infrastructure National Wealth Fund? How can we get some of those in that might take a little portion of it? So maybe you can't get the whole thing, but then that goes to Joanne's point around blending capital sources to try to get something to work. And then obviously guarantees, etc. Guarantees are really interesting because once you move it from being a property product into a financial product, not only is there a different cost, but there's also a different allocation of money. So, and the international investors always tell us this. They say that if you're asking me to invest a portion of like effectively my real estate allocation into housing in the UK, it'll be, a percentage of, make it up, like 5 billion or something. If what you're saying is you'd like me to invest in a UK financial product, i.e. like a lease or a guarantee or whatever that is, that structure, it'll be like a portion of like 50 billion. I'm just emphasizing the numbers for effect, right? But it's a much bigger pool you're fishing in for money, which is hence why it's easier in a way if those structures are there to kind of access the bigger numbers. So I think that's an interesting thing for government and is considering at the moment, is sort of like how you think about, there's a big chunk of guarantees gone into Homes England. I'm sure some of those will flow through into London at some point, and how you might benefit from all of those rather than just putting a local authority direct type position on it. Anyone got any other comments on this you want to add? Okay, I give it massive health warning because I always do when you give rates, but we're trying because I think it's really hard for everyone to try to understand stuff without anything. Any questions? We've got 10 minutes if anyone wants to chat about anything else. Any burning thoughts after that? Joanne?
So not so much a question on this, but it might be worth, before we end, you setting out the next stages of the programme and how people can get involved in that. Be useful.
Yeah, I will do. Anyone got anything else they want to contribute? Okay. So firstly then, thanks everyone who's contributed. That's great because at least I've still got a voice after an half because everyone has helped me out. And it's really good that everyone, you all know so much more than we do trying to look in and look across. So, and there's nothing better than first-hand experience being shared. We will update for things that you've told us and feed those in further. And as Joanne says, this is part really of a sort of ongoing programme of work, but we're doing particularly several work streams which are aiming to get done before Christmas around really the next stages of trying to build both the capability and capacity to bring more institutional funding in at scale, but also to actually have some tools that, you know, where projects can be got to a state where they are viable, then actually the issue isn't we can't get them moving because we don't have any funding structures and we don't have any money. We would not absolutely profess to be able to solve massive viability problems in projects. We can't. We don't have a magic position on it. But what we're trying to bring is another range of tools that can kind of accelerate, because it is very obvious there's just not enough money and funding structures in housing in London, even if you can kind of get, you know, developers moving, etc. There's still not enough, and particularly with RPs at the moment not having particularly large allocations of capital that may be able to go into new housing. So the work streams we're looking at, so particularly over the next few weeks, we're very focused on trying to re-energise pipeline of schemes for the ones that are closest to the line on delivery. So something we looked at a little while, but I think the slight challenge that probably was 12 months ago was that a lot of contributions were quite long term, which is great. We do need to build long term pipeline schemes, because if you never build them, then you never have them ready when you need them. The challenge, though, is really where we are right now, given the challenges and the numbers position, is we really need to take the benefit of the schemes that can go in the ground very soon. So what schemes are closest to delivery? And hopefully ARP are going to lead that work stream with London Councils and Housing Directors Group, and kind of like trying to get all those in from yourselves, from boroughs, and trying to sort of filter them through so that we actually do have a list of schemes that investment can go into quite quickly. Because that's the other challenge with investors, is they don't want to wait for a year or 2 years, they want to get going. And also from a development progression side, no doubt some of those schemes have got designs on them that are going to age. I know it myself, right? You know, there's nothing worse than a building that you design, you're ready to go and you're not going, because you know things are going to change on that design and it's going to cost you money and it's just not a very good place to be. So we want to try and push that. As I said, we're going to do something on the structures. So we're trying to sort of create, I think it'll probably be a deck, because it'll probably be quite pictorial. I think the request has been to be not too many words and try and be as diagrammatic and sort of, you know, simple as we can on the structures and how you might do things. So we're going to do a piece of work on that. This forms a good base, but if anyone has anything out there they want to share on that, please send it our way. We'd be most grateful. And we're trying to put that together to help everyone. And then we're also doing a piece of work on, there's a whole range of tools that get talked about that could help and generally make things cheaper, like guarantees, for example. And I think basically trying to pull those together and work with, particularly around London councils and GLA, and sort of like how those tools can get articulated into the right forums to actually get themselves from being, well, if you did this, it's helpful. And you think, well, that's fine, but how is it ever going to happen? And like, you know, is it like, how do we get to that then? To actually, who do we need to talk to get some of these things into products and packages that actually can be deployed? And so I think there's a lot of discussion going on around the Homes England tool set. As actually this morning thing, and Pat Ritchie, the chair, was there. I think they're going to come out relatively soon with more detail. There'll be GLA sort of versions of that too. But then I think there's a point around articulating what from the work we've done would most benefit investors, and is there anything in terms of how you can package those to just get some really simple and easy, and kind of helping London councils with some analysis around sort of how you can articulate that really crisply to the relevant stakeholders to influence. And I think that then takes us to Christmas. What we're ultimately trying to get to is part of a bigger package of work, which I might actually ask Nick if he's still on to just maybe say a few words about as well, is around, is there a world here where you can get a really large scale fund stroke vehicle set up that effectively could become like a purchaser of housing in London with a strong focus on affordable, but possibly not exclusively that. That means that, certainly there's no compelling anything, but if you can't get something delivered because you can't find ultimately a home for it in its investment form, then that could be a really easy way to get the investment in and get people building and get things moving. And certainly not the answer, but one of a stream of things to try to get more homes built. Don't know whether you want to add anything on that, Nick.
Yeah, well, thanks, Beck. And I think really the point or where we'd got to on that thinking was there's been a lot of work done across, as we sort of discussed today, around how we make schemes more viable or get money into the investment side. But fundamentally, we still need money coming into the demand side to buy homes and buy units, because a lot of these schemes require that side of the equation. And actually, in doing this work, we realised that that there's a sort of almost a greater appetite with some of the large scale investors that we have in thinking about that part of the equation. But if we can pool a fund that can purchase units and forward purchase units that sort of can go into some of the spaces that HAs may have been or others have been previously, but work very clearly around a sort of mandate that tries to lean into those units being used, in the same way that the RBKC scheme is thinking about buying units and prioritising for temporary accommodation or for sort of key priorities. So we think there's a real opportunity by building that pipeline that you can not only think about the support mechanisms to get those schemes moving, but also purchasers of units that can really target delivering homes for Londoners across the social intermediate sort of space and bring new capital into schemes and de-risk schemes from forward funding.
Yeah, so hopefully there's a lot of work and a lot of effort from quite a few people going into all these streams, but I just hope today was useful and hopefully everyone has taken away something. And thank you again to everyone who helped out with contributions. Probably back to you, Joanne.
Yeah, I think if you are interested in being part of the programme in some way, please drop an email to Sue, Hannah, and she'll make sure that we can find a way to engage you in the right place. But, big thanks to Beck and Nick for your work on this, and we look forward to the next stage of the programme. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.